When I was a boy, most all Georgia's roads were back roads. Now it seems like there's wide highways everywhere, and it's getting harder and harder to find a place like this. And that's a shame, because as a buddy of mine says, if something ails you, take a Georgia back road and call me in the morning. They're life's natural remedies. I'm Larry Jon Wilson. I was born on the Georgia back road just like this. My career as a singer-songwriter takes me all over the world, but it's places like this one that always call me back home to Georgia. No matter where my music takes me, I always seem to find a place that makes me want to strike out for the Georgia back roads that I've called home so long. I've seen the road to ruin and the road to fame, the high road and the low road and the road to shame, the road that leads me home again, that made me write this song. The Georgia back road that I've called home so long. We'll begin our backroads adventure in beautiful northeast Georgia. The mountains and waters of this region have drawn travelers and settlers here since the late 18th century, when the Cherokee began to give up their territory. This is the land of foxfire and deliverance, where the terrain bred isolated, self-reliant people who scraped a living from the hollows and valleys between these ancient Appalachian mountains. Over the years, the folks of North Georgia have made money from resources as rare as gold and as common as dirt. In the right hands, Georgia's red clay transforms into shapely pottery. And over 6 generations, there have been many Hewell hands that could work that magic. The Gillsville Pottery Dynasty was founded by Nathaniel Hewell before the Civil War, when this area was still an isolated frontier.
There's a way to make a living. In other words, there's farmers and there's blacksmiths and there's potters in this part of the country. There wasn't no glass jars or nothing to put their meats and milk and everything in, so they had to make jugs and churns and jars to put their milk and syrup and kraut and preserve their meats, put their whiskey in.
Oh yeah, that mountain whiskey, better known as moonshine. It's always been a thriving industry up here on Georgia's back roads, even though making it is illegal.
Way back yonder, if they hadn't had the pottery people making the jugs, they wouldn't have had nothing to put the moonshine whiskey in, so that was a good market to sell jugs. They'd sell half-gallon and 1-gallon jugs to the bootleggers and the whiskey makers across the country, so there's a lot of whiskey being made where you found pottery people. The early potters didn't sign their name on their jugs and churns and stuff, mainly because they got caught. The whiskey maker got caught making white lightning. The jug would be there and it had his name on it. He'd have to go to court and testify who bought it. And they didn't want to make their whiskey-making friends mad at them that was buying the jugs and churns.
Today, the Hewells proudly sign their wares, which are shipped far and wide. Garden pots have replaced the old storage jugs and churns, but the Hewells do still make the traditional face jugs.
Once you get in there and go to making a pot, it's a thrill to you to see you've created something, and you just want to keep on making them. It's just a habit like eating. See, you get started eating, you want to keep eating. Well, making a pot's the same way.
Wanting to make pottery is not a requirement of marrying into the Hewell clan, but sooner or later, most of the spouses get clay in their blood. With Grace, it was definitely sooner, and it stayed.
I just got in there and just went to work. My husband says, I said, let me do that. He said, oh, you don't know how to do that? I said, just step aside and let's see if I do. I was telling him and his mother that, and I just started right out to doing it because I just love the feel of clay. It's good therapy.
6th generation Matthew and Nathaniel learned to turn pots on Granny Grace's lap when they were little more than toddlers.
It's a gift to be able to work with your family for the love and closeness that you have working day by day with them. And growing up, see, I could have missed the love of my young'uns if they hadn't have been there. I would love to see it never die, just keep going down to generation. That's how much I love it. I would love for it to keep going on down.
When the first Hewell settled in these Georgia mountains, there were very few roads at all, let alone back roads as good as we have today. Traveling was only for the hardy and very little fun.
Normally, if you were lucky on a stagecoach, you were lucky to get 20 to 25 miles in a day, which means it would take me 2 days to get to Athens from here. And I can do about an hour and 15 minutes now. And a lot of times they designated roadhouses, which didn't necessarily mean a hotel. It meant it could be someone's porch or their barn or anything. You were lucky if you got to somewhere like Travelers Rest that actually had beds and that sort of thing for you to spend the night in.
Looking at the site of Travelers Rest today, it's hard to believe that this was a very busy place in the 1830s. Started in about 1815, the house changed hands several times, expanding with each owner. By 1835, it was in its present form, half residence and half luxury stagecoach inn, and owned by Devereaux Jarrett, a very wealthy entrepreneur.
At his death in 1850, the man has 14,400 acres of land, 97 slaves, and runs a sawmill, grist mill, cotton gin, tanyard, post office, ferry, tow bridge, blacksmith shop, 3 gold mines, and has this huge house. And again, he's making money off of all of these.
In the 1830s, Travelers Rest impressed some wealthy tourists so much that they wrote about it in their journals. Englishman James Buckingham recalls that he paid a quarter for half a bed.
And with half a bed means that the fella who shared the bed with him, he probably never seen in his life, probably never saw the other 7 folks in the bed in the room with him in his life either, unless he traveled all day in the stagecoach with them.
The beds in this luxury dormitory were built by Jarrett's resident craftsman, Caleb Shaw.
He appears in the 60 census and disappears by the 70. And he's not buried in the county that we can find, so we're not sure where he even went. He may have continued traveling. But back then, it's not uncommon to have traveling furniture makers. And they would travel until they found basically a family who could afford their work. And they would put him to work until he made whatever they wanted, and then he'd travel on.
Some of Shaw's furniture must have taken years to make, from choosing the tree in the forest to carefully crafting the finished piece. After a long, rough ride on a stagecoach or on horseback, Travelers Rest must have seemed like a palace lost in the wilderness. I'm sorry about the names of friends that slipped my mind from town to town. I'm sorry about the songs I miss on country roads that I can't turn down. As much as I travel, it's hard for me to go through any small town without wanting to stop and find the special something that makes that place unique. Long before air conditioning, many North Georgia towns developed as summer retreats for coastal Georgians. Clarksville was one of the most popular. It still has lovely Grace Episcopal Church as a memory of those times. Cornelia's Big Red Apple may not be quite so classy, but it is special. Cornelia sits in the middle of apple country, and there's nothing wrong with celebrating that, plumb in the middle of town. In northeast Georgia, back roads lead to some of the most spectacular scenery in the region. Tallulah Falls lost most of its water pressure when the river was dammed back in 1913, but it's still a powerful sight. On top of Black Rock Mountain, up a narrow, twisting road, sits the highest state park in Georgia, and it is spectacular. Range after range stretched to the horizon in 4 states. On a clear day, you can see up to 80 miles. Named for the black particles embedded in the rock, Black Rock Mountain is part of the Appalachian Range, which is about as old as history gets around here.
The Appalachian Range, and certainly right here in the Blue Ridge, was formed about 250 million years ago when North America, the plate that North America sits on, and the African plate essentially collided head-on, created a massive amount of heat and pressure, and the Appalachians were thrust up into the air. Over the eons since then, the mountains have been eroded down to the structures that you see today. You don't have the jagged characteristics that you see, say, in the Rockies in Colorado or Utah. These mountains are a lot more rounded, a lot gentler. But again, they're many, many times as old.
In the early years of the state, the isolation caused by these mountains bred independence and ingenuity, but it also prevented many local children from getting a good schooling. Rabun Gap Nacoochee School was founded in the early 20th century to educate some of these isolated children. Today, students from all over the world study on its picturesque campus. Georgia's mountain adults were also targeted by educational movements in the first few decades of this century. Down Betty Creek Road, which has to be one of the prettiest back roads in all of Georgia, sits the Hambidge Center. It was founded in 1934 by Mary Covat Hambidge, a weaver who was drawn to the area by its scenic beauty and the varied colors of its sheep.
She was unusual in many ways. For one thing, she was a profoundly philosophical woman and very talented. She had a very high aim in her art, and she worked with the women in the valley. She hired the women and taught them how to weave using the skills she had learned in Greece. And it was really an early cooperative effort.
The weavers of Rabun became famous for their fine products, and Mary's own fabrics were purchased by presidents and high society. Today, the Hambidge Center sells a wider variety of folk arts and crafts from its gallery in the old wormy chestnut weaving shed. The Hambidge Center owns 600 beautiful acres, which include a creek with an old grist mill.
The Hopper family owned that piece of property and gave it to Mary in exchange for her building the mill for the community. And she built what was in the 40s, a state-of-the-art facility there.
The mill is still used by local farmers, some of whom bring in corn that's been in their families for 7 generations.
Now we have a miller who's also a painter, Lawrence Holden from Atlanta, who comes up and grinds corn, and he'll take what's called a miller's toll in exchange for doing the work.
For all its apparent peacefulness, the Hambidge Center is a hive of creative activity. In the various buildings scattered through the woods, artists take advantage of the center's residency program.
We have artists come here from all over the world to paint, write, sculpt, dance, all the art forms. And I think the land inspires a lot of what happens in the artists here. We hear that over and over again. And there are 25 springs on this land. And the water is some of the purest anywhere. And I think just the combination of those things make this place really extraordinary. And it's very, very dear to me, as you might imagine.
I've seen the road to ruin and the road to fame, the high road and the low road and the road to shame, road that leads me home again. That's why I made this song. Georgia back roads I've called home so long.
Traveling the back roads of northwest Georgia You see gentle contours, vast tracts of forest, and scenic small farms in the valleys where buffalo herds once roamed. American Indian names share the map with mill towns and battlefields, so that each place you stop seems to be a crossroads of history. Here in Rossville, on the Tennessee border, the Cherokee and white cultures met and meshed and clashed. As did many settlers in this mountain wilderness, John MacDonald, a Scotch trader, married a woman of Cherokee blood. In 1797, they built this sturdy log cabin, which has survived over 200 years of use and abuse. Their grandson, John Ross, was to become the supreme chief of the Cherokee.
This house was actually what we call the first schoolhouse in this area, because of the fact that John Ross and his brothers and sisters were educated in the house. And so it was the first schoolhouse, it was the first post office, a lot of firsts.
With the discovery of gold in the area, the U.S. government decided to drive the Cherokees west. Even though he was only 1/8 Cherokee, Ross fought for the land rights of the Native Americans, many of whom were as educated and sophisticated as he was himself. When their efforts failed, he chose to go with his people on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. Many of the Cherokee were to die on that arduous journey, including Ross's own wife. Only 3 decades later, Northwest Georgia was to see more lives wasted as the blood of Civil War soldiers poured into the soil at Chickamauga. Local history or new gossip, there's no better place to swap it than at a Backroads country store like Edwards in Villanelle. In continuous operation since 1840 or before, the busy store is now owned and run with energy and efficiency by Ebeth Edwards and her family.
Come on in. Store. We didn't have one bit of experience. I'm a dental hygienist. My husband's a brick mason and a farmer, and it's been quite an education. The store runs itself, and I'm very thankful for that. 82 cents. The first thing we wanted to do when we bought the store was we started painting outside, and a lot of the older people who'd been here and to the store for years got upset and said, "You're going to change everything." So we quit painting, we left the inside dingy, and then we got to looking at the walls and found out that there's IOUs written for the last 100 years on the walls, so we wouldn't have painted them anyway. So I guess they'll stay the way they are. We open at 6 in the morning, and then we close at 8 at night, and I start making biscuits at 5:30 in the morning, and we see anywhere from 300-400 to 700 people a day. Now, some hunting, like the opening day of hunting season, we may see a few more than that, but we make, during lunch, we make sandwiches. We make anywhere from 30 to 75 sandwiches at lunchtime for people, and we stay pretty busy. Okay, can you ring him up, Anna, please? $1 in gas. I wanted to be home raising my children, so that was one of the choices that we made when we bought the store. Was we were really excited about being home with the children, but it's an adventure. Bill, what you needing? It's so much a part of the community. Yes, sir. I figured you had money. Come on in here. Our local people come in several times a day. My front bench is full most of the time. I call them my insurance policy. When something happens in the community, we usually know it. If there's a death, we usually notify people, like to cook food and to go to the funeral home. And if there's an accident, we can usually find who needs to go and help or whatever. Like during the blizzard, people set their cans out, their kerosene cans out, and said, with notes on them on the road that said, if you get to Edwards, fill this up and send it back, you know. And 2 weeks after the blizzard, we would have people coming in, paying for things that someone else got or they sent that, you know, we didn't know about. The community's just real good to take care of its people, and the store's just fortunate to be a part of it. We hope it continues to be a dinosaur, to be honest. aren't going to change basically anything. We can't paint the walls, and we probably will put in a few more gift items and things, but for the most part, it's going to stay the way it is.
Yes, back roads are just as good for time travel as they are for getting from A to B. Entering the small town of Cave Spring, southwest of Rome, is like stepping back into the 19th century. It's amazing how much was going on here in the decades before the Civil War, and it's just as amazing how much has survived. First, there were a few Baptist settlers who moved here to farm. They set their slaves to building a simple but elegant brick church. In 1839, the church was followed by a boarding school, the Cave Spring Manual Labor School. The classroom building and one of the dormitory buildings still remain. Now bed and breakfast guests can sleep where young students lived in antebellum days.
They came from all around this area, and it was founded as a boys' school at the beginning. And a lot of the students came, and it was more or less a preparatory school for Mercer University, and many fine Baptist ministers got their start here at the Baptist Academy.
Bubbling to light near the campus is the reason for Cave Spring's existence.
I'm sure that's one reason Cave Spring was settled here, was because of our wonderful water. The spring for which the town was named is in the back of the cave, and it puts out 3 to 4 million gallons of water. Very pure, cold water. And people do come all day, every day, to fill up their jugs outside the cave. That's the excess water from the spring within the cave. A lot of folks believe that it's very good, very healthy, and they won't drink anything else but that.
The spring feeds a huge swimming pool in addition to supplying water to the town and the surrounding area. Nearby, swathed in kudzu, stand the ghostly buildings of Georgia's first school for the deaf. Founded way back in 1846, the historic campus was left empty when the school was moved to a location outside the town.
3 of the original buildings are on the National Register of Historic Places. Fanning Hall, which housed the whole school at one time and became the administration building as the school grew, was here during the Civil War and was used for a hospital for both the North and South, of course, at different times. The school closed during that period of time, but there were a few deaf who had nowhere to go, and they did stay in that building.
During its heyday in the late 1920s and 30s, Cave Spring was a popular summer resort.
We had 3 hotels, and people would come and spend their summers here just to drink the water and enjoy the town. It has a natural splendor to the little town, and I think it's taken an effort, through the years to keep it that way. We have no industry in town, and I think there's been a real special effort to keep it as it was.
Springs and streams, lakes and ponds. Northwest Georgia is defined as much by water as it is by its rounded hills. The cold, clear water has always attracted tourists escaping the heat of Georgia's lowlands, and it has attracted industry. Textile mills sprang up beside many of the region's swift streams and rivers, taking advantage of their generous water power. One of the oldest is Mount Vernon Mills in Tryon. Founded in 1845, it originally made cotton for uniforms. Still operating today, it is now the world's biggest manufacturer of denim. Dalton holds another textile crown. It's the carpet capital of the world. But that claim to fame came about in an unusual way.
Well, it was solid white. It had deep, about 5-inch fringe, handmade all around the outside of it on the fringes. And it was little, pretty, white, fluffy tufts. And consequently, it was very eye-catching. Certainly was to that little girl.
That little girl was Catherine Evans. It was 1895, and Catherine had just seen her first tufted bedspread. Dazzled by it, she managed to make one for herself, starting a fashion that over the next few decades would grow into a new industry.
As Catherine got orders for spreads, she began to teach other people how to do them her method. Her aunts, her cousins, everybody up and down her street learned to tuft. And in so doing, the other ladies here began to see the spreads. And they said, wow, I do think I've got a way that we can make that a real industry.
They took materials to women out in the countryside who made spreads on a piecework basis. And soon Dalton bedspreads were going all over the country.
And so the entrepreneurial spirit of the women in Dalton really came to the forefront. And that's something we must remember, that that's a major industry that began with women, not men.
Gradually, machines were introduced, first with single needles and then with multiple needles that could make wide rows of tufts. Before they knew it, they were in the floor rug business.
Finally, this bar that housed the needles that made your spreads and your rugs began to get wider and wider and eventually turned into an 18-foot wide carpet machine. So it's an evolution that took place in quite a short time, really.
For years, Route 41 south from Dalton was called Peacock Alley because of the colorful bedspreads hanging for sale along the road. You can still shop along Route 41 for everything but bedspreads, it seems. There's something about the people and places along Georgia's back roads that inspires music. This would have to be country music. But who would have guessed that this would inspire opera songs? Surrounded by farms, the tiny community of Curryville was the birthplace of world-famous tenor Roland Hayes. The son of former slaves, Hayes became a singing star in Europe. The once rowdy mining town of Villa Rica celebrates another incredible musical talent, the father of gospel, Thomas Dorsey. Born here in 1899, the son of an itinerant preacher, Dorsey became a successful blues musician and composer. But his greatest contribution was taking the blues from the streets and clubs into the churches, creating a whole new way to worship God.
There was no gospel before Thomas Dorsey. He is really the originator of gospel music. The sound of gospel music, the instruments that are played, those were all actually brought to the church by Thomas Dorsey. And he often talks about how difficult it was in the early years really getting the church to embrace that form of music, because traditionally it hadn't been done in the black churches. And so he was bringing something totally different.
To promote the new art form, Dorsey founded the National Convention of Gospel Choirs and Choruses and conducted seminars and workshops well into his 80s.
Dr. Dorsey really felt that he was on a mission, that he had been sent to save souls through gospel music, and he always said that gospel music was good news, that if anybody who didn't know that, they needed to go back from wherever they came from, because that's what it was. And he felt that he was the messenger of good news.
It's sort of like sitting by an open fire. If you sit by it, you're gonna definitely feel the heat, and that's what gospel music does for you.
Some of today's best-loved gospel songs are Dorsey compositions, which touch the hearts and souls of everyone who hears them. When I think of Central Georgia, a number of things come to mind, and they all make me feel good. Field after field of cotton, corn, soybeans, and shady orchards, and small towns where nobody's a stranger, and
great home cooking. There aren't many big towns in the heartland, so it's just right for some backroad adventures. You'll be surprised what you can find.
Hawkinsville looks like many Georgia towns with its quiet main street and its peppering of fine restored buildings, but looks can be deceiving. This place is actually a lot more exotic than you'd think. From October through March, Hawkinsville becomes the harness horse capital of Georgia. Our state's mild winters and soft red clay have been attracting horse owners from the cold northern states and Canada since the 1920s.
It is a training facility here, and you start out, well, you just teach them how to race, basically. You start out driving them and getting them used to everything. Like they take the starting gate out here, and you drive behind the starting gate with these babies. They just get used to them, used to those things, and used to being with other horses, like, and have 3 or 4 in it together, like in a schooling race, and it just prepares them for the race when they leave here.
If they don't get them qualified here, and if they aren't ready, qualifying means eligible to race at the races, then they have to do it again up there and take more time. And they like to take them right back home and put them right into race. Horses race about once a week.
Here they come.
The people in the whole racing industry tend to know each other, and you know each other because of horses. You know each other's horses because there are magazines that publish the results of all the races, so you kind of know everybody or about everybody. And then a good deal of the people are from Michigan, where we're from, and quite a few are from Ohio, and there are a lot of Canadians here. So they're all kind of friends. They do things socially together, and they just sort of enjoy each other. But it's a business, you know, it's a business.
Harness racing isn't the only exotic business that's taken root in Hawkinsville.
Look at that. Aren't these pretty?
Yes, these are kiwis.
My husband was going to retire early, and we enjoy growing things. So some people came through doing seminars saying that they had done a study that the kiwi would grow in this area. The climate was right. And they were from New Zealand, had brought plants over and had a nursery in South Carolina, selling the plants, showing you how to lay them out, how to grow them. So we decided to try kiwi. Probably at least half the people, maybe more, have no idea how a kiwi grows. They think it's on a tree, mainly. So they are just amazed. People just say, oh, I feel like I'm in another world when I'm in this kiwi orchard. It shocks them, it really does. Kiwi are susceptible to spring frost as well as fall frost. So the second year of our plants, we lost about 90% down to the ground because we didn't have overhead sprinkler system to protect them from the cold. So we're subject to really lose, you're subject to lose your blossoms in the spring by spring frost, and you're subject to lose your whole crop or your plants by a hard freeze in the fall. So. They're a very finicky plant, too. They like certain nutritional substances that you have to have balanced. They like a lot of water. A grown plant can require 50 gallons of water a day, but they don't like wet feet. So you have to make sure that they're well drained, and yet you have to feed them a lot of water. And pruning is a major, major job because they grow like kudzu. So you're constantly pruning, even in the summertime, to keep them from tangling around each other. Many, many mornings, I wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and say, how in the world did I ever get into something with this much work? But then this time of the year comes and it's worth it.
In this part of Georgia, the counties are as plentiful as kiwi fruit on an October vine. Just south of Hawkinsville, we enter Wilcox County. By its fine courthouse in Abbeville, we pick up the trail of Jefferson Davis, fleeing the Union troops in May of 1865.
He was with his family, his wife Verena, and his children. They headed here to Irwinville, probably heading to the west, out towards Mississippi or Texas to continue the war. But the federal dragnet that was trying to capture Davis was growing larger and larger. There was, by this time, a reward being issued for Davis's capture of $100,000 because Lincoln had been assassinated, and they attempted to tie Davis into Lincoln's assassination. So this motivated the troops who were in pursuit of Davis much more. The morning of his capture, he and his family were camped at this site, and nearby were the pursuing Michigan and Wisconsin troops. Near the end of the state road which runs through this area, the troops came upon each other, and the Michigan troops were standing guard because they had already found the camp, and they were standing guard, and the Wisconsin troops thought that they were part of Jefferson Davis's party, and they came up and began opening fire, and this alerted the entire camp as to what was going on. The two men that were killed, John Rupert and John Hines, were among the last two casualties of the Civil War, and they were killed right here.
This out-of-the-way state historic site is a mecca for Civil War buffs. They come to see the spot where Jefferson Davis was captured and to browse over the collection of rare Civil War artifacts, including some items that were taken with Jefferson Davis on that fateful day. Only 30 years later, 100,000 acres of piney woods in nearby Ben Hill County were felled for an enterprise that would have seemed incredible in 1865.
It was a colony of Union veterans. And what triggered this colony in Georgia was a terrible drought that hit the farmlands of the Midwest, and it was going into the third year. The people were desperate and had to go somewhere, and they chose Georgia because Georgia sent relief trains to western Nebraska to help them. So they decided that Georgia was where they wanted to live.
The colony was the brainchild of Indiana newspaperman P.H. Fitzgerald, who sold stock in the venture and lured immigrants from nearly every state. Among them were veterans who had spent time as prisoners of war at nearby Andersonville Prison. Even those terrible memories couldn't keep them away. For the past 60 years, Beth Davis has studied the history of her adopted hometown, Fitzgerald.
And imagine 2,500 people in the heart of a pine forest trying to set up housekeeping. Now that's what happened. This was described by reporters across this nation as the greatest colonization movement our country had known since the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock.
Curious to know how the Yankees and Southerners managed to get along in those early days of Fitzgerald, so soon after the Civil War, Beth Davis once asked the son of a Union veteran how it had been.
He said, well, the way I look at it, everybody's so busy trying to get his own affairs straightened out, he didn't have time to meddle in the other fellow's business, and that's why they didn't have any trouble. But I think both sides gave a lot. They got along, and that's the wonder of this story, that they did.
Within 1 year, the town had graduated from shacks and shanties to grand homes, businesses, and schools. There were wide streets named after both Union and Confederate generals to keep everyone happy. And the elegant Lee Grant Hotel took care of the crowds of tourists who came in to gawk at the Yankees. The town had plenty to be proud of. It was time for a grand festival. As a gesture of friendship, the organizers invited Confederate veterans living nearby to join in, but decided that there should be separate parades for the Confederate and Union veterans, just in case.
They had it all worked out beautifully. But this to me is the high point of the whole thing, and I found it in an old newspaper, the paper was crumbling and falling apart. And in 1955 when I found it. On opening morning, when the doors of the Corn and Cotton Palace opened, out came the veterans. First the little band, and I said, they had a band? And they said, yes, they had a good band. Some of those old boys had played in the Army, in the band in the Army when they were back there. I said, well, they had a wonderful band. And so then, behind them came the veterans, those that had worn the blue and those that had worn the gray, marching as one behind the Stars and Stripes. And to me, they were saying to Georgia and the nation and the world that as far as they were concerned, that old war was over and done with forever. And this was again the United States of America. And here it was, old wounds were healed and old barriers broken, as men who had met on the field of battle met again on the field of everyday living, and taught this nation and the world an unforgettable lesson in forgiving and forgetting. And from that parade, they formed Battalion 1 of the Blue and Gray, the only organization of its kind in the nation made up of men of both sides of that war. And today, this museum honors men of both sides, the memory of men of both sides, and we have relics of both the Union and of the Confederacy in here.
The back roads around Fitzgerald offer up some very unexpected and varied treasures, such as Crystal Beach in nearby Ocilla. This misplaced piece of the Georgia coast is totally natural, apart from the water slides, of course. The sand is 90 feet deep in some places, a reminder that the Atlantic Ocean once ebbed and flowed as far inland as Macon. On a hot summer's day, though, ancient history is the last thing on anyone's mind. As much as we hate the heat and humidity of summer, Scuppernons love it. At Polk Vineyards between Ocilla and Douglas, acres and acres of native Scuppernons and muscadines soak up the sun, turning sweet on their shady vines.
I think when we first started, people thought we were kind of weird to be putting muscadines and Scuppernons. Those were the things you went to the woods and picked the bullaces off the vines to get. You didn't grow them commercially, but with the new varieties that we have, we found that they're very acceptable to the consumer. If you grew up in the South, especially in the early turn of the century, everybody had a grape arbor. Their grandmothers and the old home places had them. They used them for shade. They were kind of a place where you met in the afternoon to kind of close the evening out, and people have a real fond memory of them. And we found in the northern markets where people migrated from the South to the North that they know what they are. And they say, oh, I ate those when I was a child, and they really, look forward to getting them. We're open to the public, and we have, at our Pick Your Own location, a variety of about 25 different varieties of the muscadines and Scuppernons. People come and bring their families and have picnics, and they enjoy just sharing part of, their heritage, the Southern heritage, which is what the muscadine and Scuppernong, is all about.
Riding in a taxi cab up in the big city, driving man was saying how he think it's a pity how you country boys come happy and you leave uptight. I said, don't you worry about me, I'm gonna be all right. Listen, Mr. Taxi Man, I come from a long line of broom straw philosophers and home squeezed Scuppernong wine. Good Georgia wine.
Georgia's back roads really are great for discovering our Southern heritage. Each part of the state has its own special flavor, but there are sights and sounds and events and people that hold us all together. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is one of those people. The late president, recognized worldwide by his three initials, FDR, left a legacy that touched every corner of the state. But it was this part of our state, the West Central region, that gave the most back to him in return. Its springs and climate gave him strength, its gentle scenery relaxed him, and its people inspired his political ideas.
CC camps and ration stands, milk cows and wood stoves and coal oil lamps, mules and wells and kerosene, hoe cakes and syrup and strinkaline. Hard times all around.
Country life here had always been hard and unrelenting, but in the 1920s and 30s, it was made even harder by the Depression.
In that time, there just wasn't jobs to be had. A cousin and I, same age, we had ridden a freight train to Texas and back, riding, hoboing on a freight train, trying to find work, and we'd work for 50 cents a day. In fact, I did work for 50 cents a day some before I went in camp.
The Camp was the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of FDR's programs to put the country back to work and start the economy flowing.
Well, I went into CC in 1935. I left home on January 12th. I was 22 years old. I never had been out of Morgan County before, and I didn't know where I was going, and never had rode on a train before. I wonder sometime if some people feel sort of shame about it because it was a relief job. But I don't have no shame about that, because the way the country was at that time, it was reality. And we needed some relief. If somebody hadn't come along like President Roosevelt and give us relief, we wouldn't have won World War II.
One of the CCC's projects was to build the state park that bears Roosevelt's name. It includes Dowdall's Knob, one of FDR's favorite spots to picnic and spend time with friends. Boys recruited from the fields and woods were trained in forestry and construction skills, and FDR State Park still bears testimony to their solid craftsmanship. Lakes, buildings, forests, and roads. The CCC built them all with energy and gratitude.
We graded roads with nothing but picks and shells and things of that type. We had no big machine to grade roads like we had now. It was done by hand. I look at this little crooked road coming down through here, and I can imagine, I can see those boys now out there getting that road ready. With rakes, everything. I look at this stone bridge up here today these boys built down here. Now that's something. And you can't duplicate it. I mean, what I'm saying, that bridge will be there.
The climate and soil in this part of Georgia made it an important cotton growing area from the time it was settled in the 1820s until the boll weevil ravaged the industry 100 years later. Talbotton was founded and flourished during the reign of King Cotton. Here in 1846, the very first session of the Georgia Supreme Court was held. One of Talbotton's antebellum buildings is especially rare and unusual. Rare because few churches from the 1840s are still standing. Unusual because it's an Episcopal church.
Most of our settlers who came here in the 1830s were Baptists and Methodists. And from what I know and what I've read, there never was a large congregation of Episcopalians in this area. There have never been more than 12 family members of this church. And most of those, we think and read, came from South Carolina, and I think a few from Virginia. Although the building is built from native woods from here in Talbot County, the Diocese of Savannah was very instrumental in helping build this structure in 1848. The slave galleries that you see, or the balconies, were maintained and built for the slaves, which we had a very high population at that time. In 1860, we were over 16,000 people in this county, and over 50%, over 8,000 were slaves. So the masters and families brought their slave families with them, and of course that's where the balcony is, where they sat in the balcony. We do not have very modern lighting or heating in the building, so we usually have events, scheduled events around spring and fall, and we continue to use the candles that were used and would have been used in 1848, so you get the real Zion experience of being here. You may be a little uncomfortable from the hot or cool, but that's just part of being an 1848 structure.
Tiny Knoxville can lay claim to at least two famous names. It was here that John Pemberton cooked up that most Georgian of beverages, Coca-Cola. And it was here that a young girl with a crush on a soldier created one of our country's most well-known symbols from a silk skirt.
Joanna Trapman was 17 years old when she decided to design a Texas flag for Texas's independence. Her idea was, you have this one state who's fighting a battle for independence, and they felt like they were all alone. So that's how she came up with the idea of the one star. people from generations before have handed down the story that she was sort of in love or fancied William Ward, who was the colonel who would lead the group of men from Macon and go on to Texas. And so she decided that she needed to present him something here in Knoxville, I think, just to put her face in his vision one last time before he left.
Unfortunately, William Ward didn't survive the campaign in Texas, but Joanna's handiwork did and went on to become the state flag of the Lone Star State. Traveling through west central Georgia, our state almost lives up to its nickname, the Peach State. Peach growing is a major part of the economy here and one with long roots, especially at the 100-year-old Dickey Farms in tiny Musella.
It is one of the smallest towns in Georgia. There's only two industries in Georgia, our peach packing house, and then we have a cotton gin and things, so that's the only, they are both farm related, and so Musella, Georgia is a small Georgia farm town, but it's a nice town. We enjoy living here.
In the century since Robert Dickey's grandfather planted the first peach tree here, many things have changed.
It was all manual labor with mule and wagon and manually, and now we've mechanized as best we can. I mean, we've got machines that do most anything, and we don't even ship by rail anymore. It all goes by refrigerated trucks, and we have all kind of new aids in growing peaches. We have new insecticides, and we have herbicides and fertilizer formulas, and in fact the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they've developed new and better varieties that I don't know whether they taste any better than the Alberta, but they're certainly more attractive, and they are larger and redder, and it's exactly what the housewife wants. So we, just like any food industry, we cater to what the housewife wants and what the housewife will buy.
The peaches are harvested in the late spring and early summer, a labor-intensive time on the farm.
We got about 40 guys. They're all cousins, brothers, daddies, sisters. Everybody right here is part of the family. That's the thing that makes it, keep it all together, right? Especially in this business right here. We've been here for about 8 years. We haven't had any problems so far yet, you know. Has been a good guy to us.
Robert Dickey has been running the farm since the mid-50s and counts his blessings that bad weather has ruined the crop only twice in that time.
I've had some letdowns, and I guess everybody gets discouraged every now and then. Sometimes the weather's not good. Sometimes we've had disaster markets and whatnot, and we've had overlaps and whatnot. And yeah, I felt discouraged sometimes, but you go home and sleep it off, and you come back, and you know, farmers and peach growers in particular, I think they're eternal optimists. And I certainly have to classify myself as an optimist. I've got a little grandson who is 13 years old, and he does jobs around the packing house and in the orchards and whatnot, so hopefully he's gonna like it. He's been here 100 years, and hopefully it'll be another 100 years.
I wonder what Georgia will look like 100 years from now. Will there still be back roads like this one winding across the landscape? Will there still be small towns where nobody's a stranger? Will all the wonderful sights and characters and experiences we've shared still be there to enjoy? Boy, I hope so. Georgia's back roads promise an adventure around every curve, and exploring them is definitely one of life's natural remedies.
No matter where my music takes me, I always seem to find a place that makes me want to strike out for the Georgia back road that I've called home so long. I've seen the road to ruin, the road to fame, the high road and the low road and the road to shame, the road that leads me home again. That's why I made this song. The Georgia back road that I've called home so long. Georgia back roads I've called home so long.